Colleagues, order please. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 120 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Welcome to all. I hope you've all had a good week in your ridings.
All members and other meeting participants in the room of the following important preventative measures to prevent disruptive and potentially harmful audio feedback incidents that can cause injuries. All in-person participants are reminded to keep their earpieces away from all microphones at all times. Tel qu'indiqué dans le communiqué.
As indicated in the communiqué from the Speaker to all members on Monday, April 29, the following measures have been taken to help prevent audio feedback incidents. All earpieces have been replaced by a model which greatly reduces the probability of audio feedback. The new earpieces are black in color, whereas the former earpieces were gray. Please only use a black-approved earpiece. By default, all unused earpieces will be unplugged at the start of a meeting. When you are not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the middle of the sticker for this purpose that you will find on the table as indicated. Please consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. The room layout has been adjusted, as you will see, to increase the distance between microphones and reduce the chance of feedback from an ambient earpiece. These measures are in place so that we can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including and especially the interpreters, whom we thank for their work. Colleagues, there are a few items that I would like to go over at the end of the meeting.
At the end of the meeting, mainly an invitation for the Minister on Rio Tinto and Mains, but we'll keep that towards the end. Oh, you won't be here, Rick? Okay, well, we can deal with it right now and try to get it out of the way. But I see Brian first. Yes.
As Industry Committee, I'd be interested if we can actually put a question to the House of Commons. Last time I asked for one of these earpieces, they were made in China, and they were actually recreated 7 years ago. So maybe we should ask about these earpieces, and since we're talking about the quality of sound coming back, they're the standard ones in the House of Commons. So maybe as Industry Committee, we can actually ask specifically when these were manufactured, when they were tested, when they were delivered, and when the technology was actually provided. For this, because last time I checked, it was 7 years ago when the piece I got in the House of Commons was actually created, and that's manufacturing date. So perhaps that might help our audio system as it's going on.
I have no objection asking the Speaker for that information, and we can share it to members. I see Mr. Viss.
Unfortunately, I had to visit an audiologist actually 2 weeks ago here in Ottawa, and the first thing they said to me is, you guys got to get rid of those horrible earpieces. They do so much damage.
Well, good. So, and especially for the interpreters who have to wear them day in and day out for. So yeah, for sure, I'll ask the Speaker. No problem with that, and I see no objection. So thank you, Mr. Massé. Just with regards to our scheduling issue, as you know, before the end of May, as we agreed at the steering committee, we are to have another hour with the Minister on Rio Tinto. And we also have to invite him before the end of May on the main estimates. The clerk has asked for the Minister to appear on both of these subjects. However, the Minister, based on his very busy schedule, he's only available on May 8th for an hour with the committee. And I just am seeking the guidance of the committee as to whether we should invite him on mains and open the floor to all subjects or have him specifically on Rio Tinto. He's prepared to answer on both topics. It's just the time that he has to allocate to the committee that's limited. So I'm seeking guidance just in terms of what I sent out for the notice, and I know it's not going to be satisfactory to members that we don't have the Minister for 1 hour on Rio Tinto and 1 hour on mains, but what the most pressing one to me would be, well, actually, there are kind of time is of the essence for both, but I would go on Rio Tinto. That's my personal opinion. So I see Rick Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find it disappointing because last year we gave the Minister grace and didn't actually call him for estimates. and because of his travel schedule. And he had lots of notice of this request and lots of flexibility on this committee to get it done before they're reported back to Parliament, which is why they're the primary, I think, item that has to go. There's no point in having the minister much after they're reported back to Parliament. So I would ask that the minister reconsider and find 2 hours in his schedule. If it's not on that date, at least 2 separate hours to deal with both issues as the committee requested. He has found a lot of time to visit U.S. politicians and be all over the world, but he hasn't had time to come to committee, which I think is disrespectful to Parliament and the work of this committee, and I think he owes it to us to come for 2 hours, whether it's all at once or whether it's split into 2 separate things. So I would request that the committee go back to the minister and say we prefer him to come on 2 1-hour appearances as we originally requested. Thank you.
Okay, so in the meantime, given that we've agreed then out of courtesy for Jean-Denis, whose motion it was to do the 2 hours of Rio Tinto, and we agreed to it, I would suggest that on May 8th we have the minister appear on Rio Tinto, and I'll resubmit an invitation to the minister for main estimates.
If I could ask through you, Mr. Chair, the clerk, what's the date that the estimates are reported back to the House?
31st.
Yeah, end of May.
End of May. So we'd have to find another hour before the end of May.
If I've understood correctly, you're saying that when we're not using our earpiece, we have to put it right here? Is that right? Yes, that's right. Listen, I have an enormous amount of respect for the minister. He works very, very hard. It shows. But I think a minimum amount of respect for the committee and for procedures would dictate that he come for the 2 hours. It is his duty to agree to the requests of the committee, and there's no reason why he can't find 2 hours in his schedule. I mean, there are announcements all around the world. He does announcements all around the world on all kinds of issues, but when we ask for him to appear before the committee, then he should come. Yes, I do agree with you. At the same time, oftentimes, when the minister does come before the committee, oftentimes it's hard to get him to leave. So let's see what we can do. Now, I am fine with the Rio Tinto on the 8th, and then we'll see for the estimates. Even if we report the estimates back to the House, the minister will be able to come back later, even if it's not at the end of May. He can come in June to discuss that. Now, is there anyone else who would like to speak? Mr. Massey.
Briefly too, it's important, the estimates too, because as we're creating this C-27 sausage, it's important to have the minister talk about the estimates because there's money in the budget related to C-27. So the timing would be extra important this time.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to thank you first for having me at this committee, and we are willing at our end to have 2 meetings, but there has to be 2 hours at a minimum. And that said, there are deadlines, obviously, that have to be met in terms of reports, but 2 hours, we feel, is the strict minimum. Apparently, this committee has already had to move some dates around. Well, then in that case, perhaps the best thing to do would be to have the minister here on the 8th of May on the main estimates and then find time a little further on in the session for Rio Tinto. So how about we proceed like that? And if there are any urgent issues regarding Rio Tinto, well, then the minister will be willing to answer those. And we'll keep it to an hour on both. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Now, that brings me to
programming on C-27, and if I'm not mistaken, we were on CPC 4, And I'll just look at who we had. I believe we had Mr. Massé. Yeah, Mr. Massé, the floor was yours on CPC4, and then I had Mr. Généreux. So, Mr. Massé, if you want to start off, you're good to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And resuming where we were discussing the age of 18, 14, with regards to consent and everything, my biggest concern would be, and maybe we can kind of do a quick summary if you can, as to how, if we are going to go with 18, how somebody 14, 15, 16, 17 can champion themselves in terms of their data versus a potential guardian or somebody else that might have a different set of opinions about how that person's data should be handled. So it's kind of really, I'm looking at the process, how difficult it is for those individuals in that gray area that would then have to compete against perhaps somebody else that might have a different set of values or interest about their use of their data to the private sector, if that's something we could go.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour le
Thank you for the question, Chair.
To return back to page 6 of the bill, clause 4, unauthorized representatives, where it clearly notes that the rights and recourses provided under this act may be exercised, and then the most important here being A, on behalf of a minor by a parent, guardian, or tutor, unless the minor wishes to personally exercise those rights and recourses and is capable of doing so. And so essentially the reversion is to the individual. So that 14, 15, 16-year-old who wants to kind of steward their own personal information has the recourse to be able to do so, particularly if they're capable of being able to do so. And it would be the determination of the receiving entity, so the commercial actor that would be receiving the personal information, who would need to essentially challenge the assumption of the capability of the individual, which in the first instance is probably not the natural recourse, because the individual whose data you're holding is telling you what they want to do with it, and your kind of gut is to go with it, essentially. And so it would only be if there was any concerns about the potential capability of that individual that would require the corporation to potentially reconsider the determination as to whether or not that person should have recourse.
That's helpful. So let's just walk through this process. So say, for example, a 17-year-old wants to determine that. So the company, say it's Microsoft or whatever, they would then have to challenge the capabilities of the individual. So they would have to abide by the wishes of the individual. You'd have to abide by the individual first, and then the company would then have to challenge that. Would it go to the privacy commissioner to determine? So I'm just looking for the practical path.
Yeah. So essentially, what would have to happen is that, first of all, an individual would be looking to actually direct the relationship of their data. So by and large, when what we're talking about here is recourse and rights. And so let's imagine it was the right to deletion or the right for data mobility. And so the company would be receiving a direction from a 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old in this particular case to say, I want you to do something with my information. So in the vast majority of cases, those rights and recourses aren't the primary uses of personal information. It's usually the relationship to consent, and you've provided that essentially at outset. And so this would be wanting to do something with it afterwards. The process would likely be that the individual would seek via direction to the organization to say, I want you to delete my information, or I want you to move my information. The company would receive that, and it would only be on some sort of expectation that, or maybe belief that individual was incapable of being able to make that determination. My guess is they would initially go back to the individual and indicate, we're uncomfortable deleting your information because we're not sure you're capable of being able to make this determination. And then they would need to be satisfied of the capability of the individual to be in line with the law. The commissioner would only get involved if there was ever an investigation that was kind of the mind that said, we believe that you wrongly failed to live up to the rights of this individual. And so they would investigate the company's reliance on either an authorized entity or the individual as it relates to the determination made about the personal information.
Okay, and just to kind of conclude here with I used to be an employment specialist for persons with disabilities, and there was the whole People's First movement where, because they had a lot of people that, determined that they weren't capable of certain things when they were capable. How would it apply with regards to persons with disabilities as well, too? Because that has, tended to ebb and flow with societal standards, which at times have been rather poor. In many respects, and we've adjusted some, but there's still quite a bit of a challenge. So how would it apply for persons with disabilities?
So, Mr. Chair, that's where the second portion of the authorized representatives kicks in. So the rights and recourses provided under this Act may be exercised, B, on behalf of an individual other than a minor under a legal incapacity by a person authorized by law to administer the affairs or property of that individual. And so these would be legal determinations made on someone who's been determined by the courts to no longer be able to be capable of managing their affairs, and for which there'd be an appointee who would be governed by that.
Because it also, like I mentioned, persons with the dementia and people living longer and so forth. There's other types of mental health challenges that are probably going to get more complicated, or at least inclusive of the mainstream society, because it's more than just persons with disabilities now. It's also persons that will acquire memory issues as they go. So, okay, so Part B will cover that. Well, yeah, I'm just going to conclude with this again. One last question, because originally the motion from the Conservatives was at 14, then it's moved to 18, and I understand the reasons for it. But there were a lot of other submissions for 14 that came in from us. What is, I guess, have I missed anything other than that in terms of other testimony that's come in to move it to 18, or has it been still more soundly represented at 14?
I think the committee heard from a number of representatives. 14 was what was requested by a number of industry stakeholders. I think you've heard some testimony and some considerations from us as officials that 15 to 18-year-old area still contains a lot of potentially sensitive information. And so by moving to 18, you essentially scope in a greater degree of information that is still likely to be sensitive in the same way that information for a minor under 14 would be. And so I think I think the summary is probably the same in that you've heard testimony to the effect of why 14 would be useful, particularly from industry, but I think there's also considerations that have been raised about that 15 to 18-year-old range where it's highly likely that someone is still potentially consenting to information that they may still want rights and recourses to be able to affect as sensitive.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the time. It's been very helpful to get to the comfortable zone of supporting this amendment. I think it's appropriate.
Merci. Merci, Monsieur Massé.
Thank you, Mr. Massé. Mr. Généreux. Thank you, Chair. Are there any other laws in Canada under which young people are represented under the age of 18 years by authorized representatives? Well, there is no federal legislation that has been adopted that has an age of majority. There's only the voting age, but that's not necessarily associated with the age of majority. It's more who has the ability to vote during an election. Now, there's also this bill on online harm, which also brought forward a proposal for that age of 18 as the age of majority. However, right now it's only in the provinces and territories where there's an age of majority or age of minors in Canada. Well, the Elections Act is very clear. Minors are those who are under the age of 18 years old, if I'm not wrong. It seems to me that the Act is clear on that. So minors are minors until they're adults at the age of 18. Am I right? Well, the voting age was a decision on the part of the government about those who have the right to vote. But that's not really associated with the idea of majority or who's a minor. So there's nothing in the Act that says only adults can vote. The voting age is 18 years old in the Act. So it's not the age of majority. We're not talking about children, for example. It's really the voting age that's specified. Well, in this bill, we're talking about age of majority and privacy. I had a conversation with various peoples of different ages about this. We were talking about at what age can one be assumed to be able to make decisions for themselves. Now, those ages, of course, change depending on who you're speaking to because they don't all have the same perspective. You know, to my mind, I'm thinking, like, let's say in the 19th century, or let's say even 35 years ago, and when there was no internet. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 62 years old, and 25 years ago, we didn't have the same tools, the same communication tools. Now, do these tools make us more intelligent? I don't think so, necessarily. And when we think back to our adolescence, we didn't have necessarily the ability to have all this array of communication tools. There are young people today, very young people today, very, very young people, surprisingly young, who have access. I would say it's a very dangerous age to have access to some of these tools. But regardless, young people have access to this technology, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're more responsible than anyone else. Now, these are the kinds of discussions that I had with individuals. So theoretically, under 18 years is still something that should be almost self-evident. That is that you can put 14, 15, or 16 in the Act. But in Western countries, generally speaking, it's generally acknowledged that under 18 years is when you're a minor. So here we have this bill, and we're proposing 18 years. It doesn't mean that it's binding necessarily. It doesn't mean that young people have to obviously respect the law. However, I think it gives us greater flexibility. Our work to legislate means that we have to think about these young people who are perhaps more vulnerable or more easily targeted, let's say, or more naive. I mean, you can use all kinds of descriptions, but I think it's up to us to protect these people. I apologize to the interpreters for my coughing. I just have perhaps someone could give me some water, actually. As I was saying, I believe that our role is to be their stewards in a way. We have to protect them. Now, it's true that in Quebec, I think it's in Bill 25, the age of 14 is included. Now, my other question is, in terms of consistency amongst pieces of legislation, not only within Canada, but with respect to other countries, I'd like to know where you would find that age. What would be consistent? Well, thank you for the questions. There are different international approaches to this in terms of establishing rights and responsibilities when it comes to children and information. There's a children's code in the UK that establishes the age of majority, or rather the age of, say, childhood or being a minor at 18. So it means that this bill actually, yes, would be interoperable with that kind of legislation. But I think it's also important to understand that in terms of this bill, the age is important because of the fact that children are the ones we're trying to protect. So it's not necessarily a problem when you talk about interoperability. You're dealing with information and children. So this can be consistent, actually, with any legal approach in any other country because of the actual purpose here. And we're maintaining the level actually rather high. So there wouldn't be any problem with consistency. What this does is give the ability of Canada or the European Union to be consistent. Well, then, is the age of 14 not a problem then? Well, in our opinion, it's not high enough. There are adolescents who still have very sensitive information between, say, 15 and 18 years old. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Généreux.
Thank you, Mr. Généreux. I don't see any questions, perhaps. Mr. Savard-Tremblay, yes. Yes, I just wanted to make sure I absolutely understood the amendment. You've compared this with what is happening in other areas in the world. In Quebec, the age is 13. So it's even lower than the 14 that was originally proposed. I just want to make sure I understood. Let's take an example. Let's say there's a young man or a young woman that has information that might compromise them, and they want to withdraw that information. In that case, they have to go through their parents if that's what they want to do. Am I understanding this correctly? Well, if I understood, if this motion is adopted, then rights and recourses provided may be exercised by authorized representatives at that age. But if that adolescent has the ability, has the capacity to exercise their rights and recourses, then they can. All right, I want to make sure I absolutely understood. When you're talking about capacity or ability, what's the legal definition? What does that mean, actually? Well, that is a term that was adopted by the courts, and there are legal tests in the jurisprudence in terms of capacity, which outline the factors or functions that determine whether or not a person, an individual, has that capacity. So it is a legal term. There is jurisprudence for that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions on CPC 4. So I think we can now put it to a vote. Madam Clerk, unless there's unanimous consent to adopt CPC 4.
On se rappellera là que
So on the paper version, Mr. Viss had amended that. So just to be clear, it's 18 years in that amendment. Madam Clerk, we can move to a vote.
Mr. Turnbull.
Yes.
Monsieur Gahir.
Yes.
Madame Lapointe. Oui. Mr. Sorbara.
Yes, please.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Yes.
Mr. Généreux.
Oui.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Mr. Viss,
Yes.
Mr. Williams,
Oui.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay,
No.
Mr. Massey.
Oui.
Carries.
Alors, CPC 4.
CPC4 is adopted. Thank you, colleagues. And that brings us to CPC 5. And before Mr. Perkins moves it, I just wanted to...
CPC 5, Mr. Okay, Mr. Williams, but just before we Mr. Williams moves it, I just want to inform members that should CPC 5 be adopted, BQ1 would be irreceivable due to a conflict of lines. So I'll let Mr. Williams move CPC 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to bring reference also to all amendments because I think they're really important. And in this discussion, when we're talking about personal information, we certainly have our first amendment that talks about including inferred information about an identifiable individual. But I think it's important in my discussion of this that we also recognize some of the other amendments. And perhaps through this discussion, I know it would be a vote here, but out of 4, I think we can probably come to an agreement of some kind of consolidation of this, as we've done in past amendments. But I'll start off with what we're talking about. We talk about personal information is information about an identified individual. But when we're talking about ADA and the age of AI and big data, we've identified that we also need to make mention of inference. An inference can lead to a depth of revelations, such as those relating to political affinity, interest, financial class, race, etc. And this is important because the misuse of such information can lead to harm to individuals and groups in the same way as collected information, a position confirmed by the Supreme Court in Ewart versus Canada. In fact, as noted by the former European Article 29 Data Protection Working Party, more often than not, it is not the information collected in itself that is sensitive, but rather the inferences that are drawn from it and the way in which those inferences are drawn that can give cause for concern. General support for the idea that inferences constitute personal information can be found in past privacy commission decisions and Canadian jurisprudence. For instance, the OPC has found that credit scores amount to personal information. PEPIDA report of findings number 213008, among others, and that inferences amount to personal information under the Privacy Act. Accidental disclosure by Health Canada, paragraph 46, for instance. This is also consistent with Supreme Court's understanding of information privacy, which includes inferences and assumptions drawn from information. So there is, and we've had the Privacy Commissioner give past cases on this. In light of these conflicting viewpoints, we believe the law should be clarified to include explicit reference to inferences under the definition of personal information. This would be in accordance with modern privacy legislation, such as the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. Looking at this, I normally note the GDPR as being the gold standard. We think the California example is the better example for personal information. To go further into that, and when we talk about personal information, one limitation of the definition is its broad scope, which can encompass a wide range of data, including information that may not always directly identify an individual. And this can lead to ambiguity and challenges in determining what constitutes personal information, especially in cases where data points are combined or analyzed in aggregate. Additionally, the definition may not adequately address emerging technologies and forms of data, such as IoT devices or anonymized data, as we've talked about before, that could potentially be re-identified. So besides the inclusion of inference, to improve the definition to look more at the California example, it could include specific criteria or examples to clarify what qualifies as personal information. Additionally, incorporating provisions for emerging technologies and data types would enhance its applicability and reference. To look at how it's defined in the California Code, this is how it reads right now. Personal information includes, but is not limited to, any information that directly identifies, relates to, describes, is reasonably capable of being associated with, or could be reasonably be linked directly or indirectly with a particular consumer or household. And then they include examples, which I think is really important. So they say this includes, but is not limited to, names, postal addresses, email addresses, social insurance numbers, driver's license numbers, passport numbers, financial account numbers, credit card numbers, biometric information, geolocation data, internet protocol IP addresses, device identifiers, browsing history, and any other information that could be reasonably be used alone or in combination with other data to identify an individual or household. So we talk about, it's much better to talk about human information. We talk about privacy because it refers us back to human beings, but giving examples allows the privacy commissioner, when looking at cases, to look at exact examples and then in a court of law have those more defined. So, Mr. Shan, I'll start with you. Starting with the inferred information as defined in this amendment we're talking about, does it constitute the same protection as personal information throughout the entire bill, even with this proposed amendment?
Merci, Monsieur le Président, pour les questions.
Thank you, Chair, for the question.
Understand it, CPC 5 codifies the existing interpretation of personal information by the OPC, which, as the member has noted, has been also codified by the Supreme Court, which includes inferred information. And so we would see this as consistent with the current approach and codifies it in law as it is currently both jurisprudentially and understood by the regulator.
And you might have answered my question already, but with this new definition, is personal information still regulated to appropriately reflect the inclusion of inferred information as exists in the California Privacy Act and Australia's Privacy Act?
Inferred information as codified in this way would be consistent with a number of international best practices on the kind of understanding of personal information, including California, but also the EU GDPR and Quebec Law 25.
So I know that we're looking at this clause, but also that, you know, as before, the discussion was if this clause was to go through, it would take away the other three amendments, the other three clauses. So given the discussion that I introduced, looking at the California section of the Privacy Act, identifying certain use cases for personal data, would that fall in line with what you think would strengthen this bill?
So, Mr. Chair, I think this is one zone where the devil will very much be in the details. So I think we've had discussions at this committee before about exhaustive versus non-exhaustive lists and where lists are indicative but not exclusive. And so insofar as an amendment suggests what personal information is, we would see that as actually limiting, because right now the definition, including with this amendment, will still be quite broadly interpretable in the sense that it means information about an identifiable individual, and then with the amendment would amend that definition to ensure that it expressly captures inferred. But if it starts to go into a list of potential technologies or zones, it would very much depend on the construction, because sometimes the construction of some of those amendments actually becomes a definitive list, which means it's not further expandable over time, and so you'd have to word it appropriately to ensure that this was indicative and illustrative, not exhausting, and so this is a zone where OPC guidance and jurisprudence can often fill that gap, particularly as it could then keep up with the times and the technology, rather than hardwiring things into the legislation that might not kind of stay current.
And I agree with that, because I think in the past we've disagreed within regulation, which may not define, but could we use a word, you know, such as, you know, is there a language that would allow that list not to be limited and exhausted, as you point out?
So I would, in broad strokes, say things that say includes but are not limited to can be helpful in some of those indications. But as I say, I'd have to see the specific wording, because the challenge is you'd want to make sure that you weren't narrowing or closing to just the things that you were then about to list.
And that's where I think, through you, Mr. Chair, we do have a NDP 4, and why we bring this up now is if we pass this first motion, be eliminated. It does have wording in that, including identification number, location data, online identifier, or one or more factors specific to their physical, psychological, or physiological, genetic, mental, and economic culture or social identity. The wording in NDP 4 is that can be used to identify them directly and includes their name, but I guess what we'd be looking for then is to something that says such as could include, right? So that would be probably the wording that we'd be looking for.
I'll turn to my colleague, but you're right that currently our worry about NDP4 would be that it would be seen as a closed list because it says includes and then lists things as opposed to something like includes but not limited to. But I'll turn to Mr. Chhabra.
Thanks so much. So thank you for the question. I think it's important to recognize as well that the formulation of the list can be done in a way that unintentionally narrows. And in this case, what we're looking at specifically, in addition to the issues that Mr. Sean mentioned, it might unintentionally reduce the range of personal information because it specifies only that which is used to identify an individual. That could exclude a series of very important buckets of information that are currently considered as being personal information under the Act. An individual conducting certain types of searches or visiting certain types of websites online. That might not be information that identifies that individual, but it is about that individual. And the current definition of personal information is information about an identifiable individual versus here where it says information that can be used to identify them directly or indirectly for NDP4. And this goes back to Mr. Sean's point about constructing the definitions in the manner that is the most inclusive and broad as possible to allow for jurisprudence to evolve and to allow for the OPC to issue guidance to enable better kind of understanding within the industry about what's meant, but without locking us in at the legislative level.
You go back to the California code. It says personal information includes but is not limited to any information that directly identifies, relates to, describes, is reasonably capable of being associated with, or could reasonably be linked directly or indirectly with a particular consumer or household. So it's quite a longer definition before they list the examples. Should we be looking for that kind of a definition? And again, we're talking about inferred on one side.
Yep.
But again, when we look down the list, so I think NDP 5, no, sorry, I think it was the block amendment, talked about group, including a group, correct? Identify an individual or a group. Would this longer definition, would this, be, looking at the California code and saying that they've really nailed that first part of the definition, would that be something that would encompass all of the amendments that we've looked at?
So right now, that work of the California kind of lengthy description is being done by the word about in current PIPEDA. And about has been sufficient from a court perspective to get at a wide range of inferred and direct information about individuals. It's how the court ruled on information related to inferred data. It's how the court ruled on things like IP addresses. So about has been sufficient jurisprudentially and from guidance perspective to get to all of the things that California has tried to do with a much longer list. The problem, of course, of going to a much longer list is twofold. One is you're shifting from about to something else, which the courts have tended to have a rational kind of approach to say you did that on purpose. So clearly, what is it that's different between about and this new list that suggests that you weren't happy about, and so is it, and the worry, of course, then is because it's now a much longer list, is it exhaustive? Is it now seen as potentially overly narrowing? Whereas that was all being done by about and got to good places, both by the OPC and by the courts. And so this is always the concern about potentially inserting something that adds more words, but potentially actually doesn't actually do more work than what about in the current definition already does.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to let others chime in so we could further discussion to see what the other parties are thinking.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. And just as a point of clarification, what you've mentioned, if CPC 5 is adopted, BQ1 cannot be moved, but NDP 4 and NDP 5 could still be moved. Mr. Massey.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think we're playing a game of snakes and ladders here as we go back and forth with all of the different numbers here. I'm just trying to figure this one through. Is it? I think we're trying to make it better, but we don't want to make it worse. Is what's kind of happening here. So if I and I appreciate the Conservatives bringing this the motion or amendment forward. If we go with NDP4, though, and inserted but not limited to, would that be a better fix, or are we... Okay, that's what I want to hear. It's, we're trying to get to the same place here. So
indeed,
so please.
Unfortunately,
be frank.
because the construction of NDP4, as Mr. Traba says used to identify them, as opposed to the current definition which is about them, and about does more than just used to identify, because about suggests a generality around you, which is where inferred information got read in by the courts. And so if we go back to identify, so like if it was individuals that can be used, see, the construction is challenging because you need to keep about somewhere in there so you can get at the kind of broader construct.
Okay, so, and then block 1, is there, I guess if we're looking to try to bolster what we're trying to do here, which amendment should we be kind of constructing off of here, if there is a path forward to that? So we've ruled out NDP 4, which is fine. Again, I think we're all trying to get to the same spot.
So CPC 5 avoids that challenge. NDP 5 also avoids that challenge. BQ 1 and NDP 4 shift the construction, and BQ 1 introduces this construct of group rights, which I think would vastly alter the definition of personal information that is currently understood in our jurisdiction or others.
Okay, so we're really looking now, and please say no if I'm wrong. So we're looking really at the current one that's in front of us, our NDP 5, as being the better of the options that are going forward.
CPC 5 and NDP 5 both codify the inclusion of inferred information without resting a definition of personal information about being solely that which is used to identify, because again, identification is only one half of the battle here. It's also the inference or the generalities about someone that go beyond just the pure precision of identify.
And from those two choices, is there one that's preferable?
I think I think they're both workable. I think we've got CPC 5 in front of us.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Again, it's about getting the result.
Yeah.
I think NDP 5 is better, but I'm just joking. But no, it's but we all want to get the same space. So thank you very much. That's been very helpful, and I'll turn the floor back to the chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Turnbull.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull.
I'll be quick. I think our position is that CPC 5 is something that can be supported. But based on, I think, Mr. Williams' questions, it may actually, inferred information may already actually be included in the interpretation of PIPEDA and the EU GDPR. Is that not correct, Mr. Shan?
Yeah. So the current interpretation by both the OPC and the courts is that personal information, as defined in PIPEDA currently, which is being ported to CBPA, includes inferred information.
So including it doesn't really add a whole lot, except maybe for greater certainty, as you guys say sometimes. I know that's a term that comes up in this committee a lot. So it may actually improve the bill ever so slightly in terms of just being a bit more explicit that inferred information is included. Would you say that's sort of...
That's correct. It takes the current legal and regulatory approach and ensures that it's legislated.
Okay, great. So maybe, I mean, I appreciated all the questions on the other amendments that have been proposed, and maybe we'll get into those in a moment. But maybe we can vote on this one. I'm certainly prepared to support CPC 5.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres interventions?
Does anyone else wish to speak?
We call a vote on CPC 5. Mr. Van Leinen.
I just want to clarify, I think there was some discussion about including the words "but not limited to" information, and with the absence of that, is that something that you had indicated earlier, Mr. Shan, that you wanted to see included in that amendment?
I think in this formulation in CPC 5, it's not necessary because it still says about an individual, and so.
Thank you.
Okay, so I see no other comments, so I will call it to a vote. CPC 5.
Mr. Turnbull.
Support.
Mr. Gahir.
In favor?
Madame Lapointe. Oui. Mr. Sorbera.
Yes, please.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Yes.
Monsieur Généreux.
Wait.
Mr. Perkins.
Yes.
Mr. Viss.
Yes.
Mr. Williams.
Wait.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Wait.
Mr. Massey.
So it carries. Merci à tous.
Thank you all. As I said previously, this means that BQ1 is no longer in order because CPC 5 was just adopted, which brings us to NDP 4. But before giving the floor to Mr. Massey, I wanted to say that if NDP 4 is adopted, then NDP 5 cannot be moved because there will be a line conflict.
Between which one you want to move, because if NDP 4 is adopted, then NDP 5 cannot be moved.
Actually, Mr. Chair, I think within the discussion, I can drop NDP 4 and 5. I'm comfortable where we're at this point
Okay.
with the discussion that we've had and working that through. So.
Okay, so they are not moved. Well, I don't think we've gone this fast ever before we started, so let's keep it going. Yeah. Yeah. Which brings us to CPC 6, which I have under Mr. Perkins, NDP 6. But it will be Mr. Généreux, donc Monsieur Généreux sur CPC 6.
Mr. Généreux on CPC 6. Thank you very much, Chair. So the purpose of our amendment, which is a new one, is to deal with profiling. And I'm just going to read it. Profiling means any form of automated processing of personal information consisting of the use of personal information to evaluate certain personal aspects relating to an individual, in particular to analyze or predict aspects concerning that individual's performance at work, economic situation, health, reliability, behavior, location, or movements. So, contrary to any other, say, codes or in the European Union or other legislation, these laws do not have to include information about profiling or automated processing. The only obligations would apply would be those regarding recommendations on behalf of an individual. So even though profiling can be implicitly included in recommendations or predictions, if it's not explicitly included in the legislation, then there is unnecessary ambiguity which will lead to shortcomings in the protection of privacy. And what this could mean is that rather vague or opaque activities regarding data of individuals may not be as transparent as necessary. It's not clear whether these obligations would also apply to places like Meta or Facebook. This was underscored by the Privacy Commissioner in the brief that was presented before the committee. Even though there's no mention of the word profiling in any of the sections in C27, the Conservatives are proposing the inclusion of profiling in other areas, which means that we need a definition. There has to be a definition in order to be able to adopt other Conservative motions to amend various sections. And so when it comes to automated processing of personal information that deals with profiling, a definition has to be included. Organizations should be held to certain standards, and they have to be able to justify this profiling. So I do have a question, with your permission, Chair, for the witnesses. The Privacy Commissioner and other witnesses said that they were concerned by the existing flaws when it comes to decision making. Are there any other flaws in this bill dealing with automated processing of personal information? Thank you, Chair, for the question. There is not a definition of profiling in this bill. However, the concept is included under the requirements and obligations of automated decision-making. So that is actually automatically included. However, if you really want it to be codified, if you want this automated processing or decision-making to include the concept of profiling, I think this could be a positive change. Under other legislation, there are distinctions between the profiling of groups and individuals. So I'd like to know if there are any other sections in this bill that do not take into account these situations when a group or an individual decides, say, to sign up. So let's say an individual is within a group. Is it possible for them to withdraw from that group in question? Well, if that information remains and it's identifiable or de-identifiable, well, it's up to that individual to make a request to have their information deleted from that group and from that group's pool of information, from their database, basically. If it's de-identified, as we were talking about earlier on, then there is no such thing as an individual. And in that case, there's no information actually to be used. But if profiling isn't defined, knowing full well that we know that profiling exists, then, and I would say, for example, racial profiling is a very important issue. I've heard this in terms of, say, data collection. Now, I don't necessarily want to get a debate about this. However, we have heard many times, for example, in Montreal, that there is racial profiling, for example, in the area of public safety. So these are individuals then who are part then of an identifiable profiled group. And that crosscuts with their, say, privacy or their private lives. So should there not be an explicit definition then of profiling? And if there isn't, then could these individuals be at risk of being profiled without even knowing? And so they won't necessarily know what to challenge. Well, that's a good question. And as we discussed earlier, personal information includes any information about an individual. So it does include profiling. We're not just talking about information to identify an individual, it's all information about that individual. And so if that information remains in a database and is used, say, for profiling, whether that be for marketing or for, say, suppliers of any sort, well, that remains personal information about an individual. So all those rights and recourses about information still belong to the individual. Perhaps my colleague would add. Well, I would add that because we've included inferring, any inferred information, it would be included. Because as my colleague said, if you're going to profile, well, that includes inferred information, whether it be through a group or otherwise. All right, so if I understand, though, you're not against including it. Do you think, then, what I would say is we thought this was important, essential to put this in the bill, but would you think that it would be important to include it? Well, we feel that it's already included in the definition, and it's not necessary to define that concept, but it could be useful for other amendments that are being brought forward by the Conservative. Now, when it comes to interpreting the Act, the concept is included. It can be a good thing to include a specific definition, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Turnbull, followed by Mr. Viss.
So my understanding from the last exchange is that the concept of profiling activities are already included in the bill. Is that right, Mr. Shen?
That's correct.
And it's the construct around automated decision-making models that there are specific requirements for that are included in the bill. Is that right?
That's right.
Could you describe what those requirements are briefly?
To my colleagues.
Sure. It's transparency requirements. So essentially, organizations using ADS systems, automated decision-making systems, have to tell users that they're using automated decision-making system. Once a decision is made using such a system, an individual can also ask for that decision to be explained. How exactly was personal information used to make a certain decision using an ADS system? So those are the two requirements with respect to ADS systems.
Okay, got it. So is the inclusion of this definition going to create any problems in interpretation of the bill? Is there any confusion that it could create?
We don't see any confusion. We don't see any confusion. It adds an interpretation that already exists within the law, but is not at odds with the current interpretation.
So sort of similar to inferred information, which was in a way already included in the bill, but adding it explicitly doesn't necessarily harm the interpretability of it.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Okay, so this is not a hill we're going to die on. We'll support you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Viss.
Thank you, Mr. Viss.
Going back to the good work this committee's done on putting the best interest of children as a paramount concept at the onset of the legislation or future legislation. Does the department, Mr. Chair, acknowledge that, I'm thinking in the context of my 4-year-old son, that companies seek to profile children who may get a hold of their parents' iPad and want to buy the latest Paw Patrol. It's like Paw Patrol's everywhere. It's this is a known fact that companies that have access to the Paw Patrol licensing are profiling and trying to get parents like me to buy some really crappy toys that fill up my basement and I find underneath my couch. Bringing it back down to reality.
Yeah. No. So obviously, profiling as a function of kind of taking personal information, automating that in some ways, and then using that to market to an individual would require the individual to be informed about the fact that there's an automated decision-making system at play, also to know which personal information is being utilized to make that determination. And because we've determined that children's information or is sensitive, corporations would be required to adopt appropriate privacy management programs to ensure that the sensitivity of the information, for instance, of your 4-year-old, is not utilized in inappropriate ways. And so how are they protecting that? How are they linking it? So linking it, for instance, to your information could be acceptable in certain circumstances, but would need to be clear in terms of how consent was offered and how it was dealt with.
So when and if C-27 is passed, the bill would provide the safeguards needed with some of the amendments already passed to stop that current commercial practice.
That would be very much dependent on the use cases related to what was consented and how.
Based on the example you just gave about what an obligation of a corporation would be.
Yeah, so again, not knowing what the initial service agreement was with the individual, so when the information was actually collected, so when the account for your 4-year-old was first generated and they were told in plain language, which C-77 will require, this is what we're going to do with your information, and are you comfortable with that? Now, first of all, it's a 4-year-old, which means you're making that determination. No, I'm sure your 4-year-old is probably very clever, but probably wouldn't meet the capability test struck by the Supreme Court to make determinations on their own. So you would be making that determination to say, I'm willing to hand over this information, and depending on. And there's guidance on that in terms of then what occurs, but it would be very much determined on what you said yes to, about what then they could come back to you with to say, hey, looks like you might be in the household that accompanies a 4-year-old. So I bet you probably really like Paw Patrol. Maybe you should watch or buy more of it. So it would depend on what you originally consented to. But it's sorry.
The other scenario that I'm concerned about, so the first one being, hey, my kid has an iPad, don't judge me, please, but sometimes they get to use that on the weekend. Whatever, it happens. And those things happen with Paw Patrol. And I know Bernard's laughing because it's his grandkids. And that's a fact. I've been to his house. I've seen the Paw Patrol. The other scenario is, in my household, I have an Amazon Alexa, which, again, don't judge me, but this is the life I live. And my children put on all sorts of wild music, like these frog songs right now. I can't get over them. But it's also my phone, my iPhone and my Samsung, they listen to me as well. And it all seems to be tied together. So on Saturday night, we're cooking Filipino food. And my wife's telling my children about why we're doing this a certain way, because that's what she does and it's part of her culture. And then, like, the next day, you go on Facebook and you're going to see reels of Filipino cooking. That is a fact. That happens to everyone. My reels are often rugby, politics, and Filipino food. So there we go. that I listen to. So the other scenario I'm concerned about with children is profiling will still, and I don't believe that this law is going to stop all of the things that all of us kind of get concerned about when it relates to children. But the other scenario is all of these things are being said in the context of a home, and I know most of us probably have a Google or Alexa-style device in our household. It's pretty ubiquitous now. We're not going to be able to stop all types of profiling, even if we have very strong safeguards and clear language in the bill, because there's so many ways that corporations will be able to circumvent the intention of the law, and it's going to take court cases to try to really go the next step in protecting kids. Would that be a fair assessment?
I'd say continued guidance and jurisprudence help flesh out the responsibilities that will be borne out or that are being identified and adopted through this piece of legislation. So by making the broad parameter that children's information or the information of those under the age of 18 is sensitive, and thus requiring a higher bar for its treatment, protection, and use, I think will get fleshed out by guidance and by jurisprudence as to how companies actually then have to interact with that obligation. And so the degrees to which modern and new technologies, and this is why it's really important that the law remains technologically neutral, is there will be new tools that will allow for this information to be used in ways that we don't anticipate right now. But by having broad definitions like that personal information is information about someone, or that an automated decision-making system is a decision that uses information to automatically make a determination about you, is useful because it means that people are held to those standards. And so I concur that each of these use cases are going to be very particular to, like, what did you sign up for? What did you agree to? What did you say? And then what do you actually what's actually happening to your personal information? But I think the general constructs that we're getting at, particularly today, on this includes inference. This includes the rules by which your information may live in a broader data set that is still being used to make determinations about you, which means you have some recourse or right as it relates to your privacy therein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Monsieur Viss. J'ai pas...
Thank you, Mr. Viss. I see that no one else wants to speak to CPC 6. I'm looking at those online. No. In that case, I will call the vote. I don't see Mr. Massey. And I don't see Mr. Williams. They should be here, but is there a consensus on CPC 6? Perhaps we could go via the consensus route.
Yeah, I'm just. I think we can probably go with consensus on this one. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so it's adopted, which brings us to CPC 7, and I have. So Mr. Massey, Mr. Williams, we adopted CPC 6 by consensus, if that's fine with you all. And if it's not, it's done already. So so CPC 7, I have Mr. Perkins, but I'm guessing it's someone else on the Conservative side moving it. Mr. Viss, the floor is yours.
Didn't think we'd get this far today. Wow. Okay. Well, this follows nicely the good dialogue we just had with Mr. Shan regarding how implicit or explicit this bill actually becomes. CPC 7 proposes to define sensitive information. Sensitive in relation to information includes any information pertaining to an individual that reveals A, their racial or ethnic origin, B, their political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union or political membership or political contribution history, C, their sexual orientation or sexual habits, D, genetic data or biometric data that can uniquely identify them, E, their health condition, including any treatment or prescription on their medical record, F, government identifiers such as their social security, passport, or driver's license numbers, G, the content of their electronic devices, including messages, images, address books, calendars, and call history, their passwords, or H, financial data. C27 makes several references to the term sensitive information and sensitivity without providing a definition to the term. This approach is incredibly problematic for consumers and businesses, as the definition is left to interpretation, with the obvious risk that some information will be regarded as sensitive data and others as not, and those interpretations will vary. To resolve this issue, stakeholder groups as well as the Privacy Commissioner have advocated for a clear definition of the term, outlining a list of items legislators constitute as sensitive information. I'll note in committee testimony on October 28th, the Center for Digital Rights stated, at the moment, the definition of sensitive categories of personal information is left without is left open, and the words sensitive and sensitivity are used throughout Bill C-27 without definition, with the exception of minors. Thus, the definition is left to the organization with the obvious risks that some sensitive data will not be regarded as such and that interpretation will vary. So as to provide certainty for Canadians and Canadian businesses and to align with both Quebec's Law 25, and this is a key element that differ the CPPA from other modern privacy laws like the EU GDPR and those found in California and Quebec. Bill C-27 should define sensitive information first by establishing a general principle of sensitivity, followed by an explicitly open-ended list of examples. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner, in his submission to our committee, and I state that a definition of sensitive information be included in the Privacy Protection Act that would establish a general principle for sensitivity, followed by an open-ended list of examples. In the GDPR, Article 9, Paragraph 1, processing of personal data revealing racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, or trade union membership, and the processing of genetic data, biometric data for the purpose of uniquely identifying a natural person, data concerning health or data concerning a natural person's sex life or sexual orientation shall be prohibited. As it's very clear, we relied heavily on the GDPR example in putting forward this proposed amendment. I'll note the Canadian Research Insights Council on May 9th stated Bill C-27 could offer more protection for minors, for which the bill is nearly silent. Bill C-27 indicates that information with respect to minors be considered sensitive information, but offers no definition of minor nor sensitive information. Australia's Privacy Act follows a similar line of language to the GDPR. In America, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act outlines a whole suite of matters related to their definition, including a government-issued identifier like SIN number, passport number, or driver's license number, any information that describes or reveals the past, present, or future physical health, mental health, disability, diagnosis, or healthcare condition or treatment of an individual, financial information, biometric information, genetic information, precise geolocation information, an individual's private communications, passwords, sexual orientation or sexual behavior in a manner inconsistent with the individual's reasonable expectation regarding disclosure of such information, calendar information, address book information, phone or text logs, photos, audio recordings, or videos maintained for private use by an individual, regardless of whether such information is stored on the individual's device, non-consensual intimate images, information that reveals the video content or services requested or selected by an individual, and minors information. I'll go on that Daniel Konikoff from the University of Toronto stated to us on October 24th, the term sensitivity appears often throughout the CPPA, yet it remains undefined in the bill's glossary. Bill C-27 should follow global standards and explicitly define sensitive information to capture the above-mentioned categories with an emphasis on biometric information, which is at the core of an individual's identity. The EU AI Act is already ahead of the curve on this, explicitly defining biometric data in a way that acknowledges its sensitivity, its unique capacity to identify a person, and the importance of consent in systems that identify based on physical, physiological, behavioral, and psychological human features. The CPPA's failure to capture biometric data as sensitive information leaves far too much to interpretation and may lead to businesses to establish inadequate protections or none at all for information that merits stronger safeguards. Without this definition, other sections of the CPPA, such as 53.2 and 62.2E, which refer to retention periods for sensitive personal information, or 57.1, which pertains to establishing safeguards proportionate to the sensitivity of the information, are left open to interpretation. I'll stop there. California follows the federal law in America, which provides many of the same, much of the same language in terms of sexual orientational, racial or ethnic origin, religious or philosophical beliefs. And I'll note that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, outline that sensitive information remains undefined in Bill C-27. Parliament should follow international standards and explicitly define sensitive information to better protect special categories of personal information. Bill C-27 defines personal information as information about an identifiable individual. According to the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, personal information includes names, ID, number, location data, online identifiers, or factors to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of a person. I'll stop there. I think there's ample testimony from business and civil liberty groups and the Privacy Commissioner outlining the need to have a definition in there. I do, at the same time, acknowledge some of the rationale we've heard from the department about the nature of lists, but I also rely heavily on the expertise of the Privacy Commissioner when putting this forward, and our intention behind it to avoid broad interpretation when and if this bill is enacted and becomes the new standard for Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Monsieur Viss. J'ai Monsieur Savard-Tremblay sur ma...
Thank you, Mr. Viss. I have Mr. Savard-Tremblay and then Mr. Turnbull. Thank you very much. I just wanted to submit a sub-amendment to the amendment that was brought forward. I think there should be a J rather, that any other information that could be a breach of privacy. Could you please send that in writing to us in both official languages? And could you then repeat that slowly? So I'd like J, any other information that would be a breach of a fundamental right to privacy.
Waiting, Mr. Chair. What's the relationship, sorry if I missed this earlier and you stated it, what's the relationship between CPC 7 and NDP 6?
There's none. So it's being sent around, I believe, to the clerk and then to members. But you've all heard it. So there's a sub-amendment that's been moved by Mr. Savard-Tremblay. So I'll open the floor to debate the sub-amendment, which we have to deal with before we can go back to the amendment per se. Mr. Turnbull.
Thank you, Chair. If I understand the intention of Mr. Savard-Tremblay's sub-amendment, it would be to include any other information that would be a breach to the fundamental right of privacy added on to the long list of factors that's there. Is that correct? So essentially that list would be deemed inexhaustive and would include any other information. Just, it's a clarification question if I could allow him. I think I'm understanding correctly.
Would you like to answer, Mr. Savard-Tremblay? Well, I just want to leave the doors open because we do have a list here that is trying to be exhaustive, but there may be other potential information that could violate the fundamental right to privacy. So I think that it would lead to other ways of interpreting information in the future that may not be included here.
So I guess what I'm wondering here is, you know, there are some concerns. I guess what I'm struggling with is this definition that's being amended, or this section being amended, is adding factors or categories of types of information that would then qualify as sensitive and then would then require express consent in all circumstances. Is that correct, Mr. Shan? Could you maybe clarify for me if I'm interpreting this correctly?
That is correct.
So are there any concerns with, for example, financial information or biometric data that would pose any potential risks in terms of overregulation. And I just wonder if this is something that financial institutions, for example, are used to dealing with.
Thanks for the question. I'll start and then I'll turn to my colleague. I think generally what I would say is the broad ambition of making sure that information that is quite personal in nature holds a high degree of protection by commercial actors. And I think that's a shared ambition for the entirety of this piece of law. And the rationale for why we have a definition of personal information and what's being proposed here as sensitive information is that there is some information that is personal in nature that is not sensitive. And ideally, while we get as precise as possible for both corporations to understand their obligations, we leave room ideally for two things. One is for the OPC to be able to have capacity to be able to kind of continually interpret and understand the changing nature of information. And the second is to allow for context to inform information. In many cases, some of these identifiers, are not seen as personal information per se. So my address, unless I've restricted it in various formats, is not always sensitive in the sense of it can be found in all sorts of public directories and various other things. But the fact that that might be linked to data, for instance, about the sale price of my house, which suddenly includes financial information, is now complexifying the use case of that, because now is the person who's in possession of my address is thus now sensitive, and they should be treating it as such, and I should only be able to offer expressed consent for the use of that. And so this is where I think, and I'll turn to Mr. Chabra, but this is where I think we would desire to make sure that we're getting at all three of those ambitions. One, that we've made a distinction between sensitive information and personal information, recognizing that some information is in fact more sensitive, more protected, more in need of protection. Two, that we've left room for OPC guidance. And three, that there's some room for context because information is not necessarily always the same in every single situation. And so with that, I'll turn to Mr. Chabra.
Thanks very much. Just to follow on Mr. Sean's points, CPC 7, the way we read it, would establish very broad categories for sensitive information that go beyond what is currently contained in the EU's GDPR or that which is found in the Privacy Commissioner's own bulletin on sensitive information. It doesn't allow for a contextual analysis or what defines sensitivity in a given scenario. An example of that would be that the GDPR for example, does not identify financial data as being universally sensitive, and I think that was the nature of the question. That's also aligned with the findings of the OPC and Canadian courts, which have stated that all financial information is not sensitive and that sensitivity depends on the circumstances. There was a case, RBC v. Trang in 2016, where the federal court found that the degree of sensitivity of specific financial information is a contextual determination. The sensitivity of financial information, in that case, the current balance of a mortgage, must be assessed in the context of the related financial information already in the public domain, the purpose served by making the related information public, and the nature of the relationship between the mortgagee, and directly affected third parties. That case was cited as well by the Privacy Commissioner's updated guidance on the meaning of sensitive information, which was published in 2022, and it illustrates scenarios in which there may be very valid and important reasons to have the sharing of certain financial information under certain prescribed circumstances, but to declare all of it sensitive would not allow for that contextual understanding.
To follow up on that, thank you for that clarification. I think what I'm hearing is that, and what I'm inferring from this is that if you're deeming all of these categories of personal information as essentially sensitive information, you're raising the bar to require express consent in every single circumstance, which eliminates any room for context dependence to be considered. What would be the burden on potentially at least on industry that probably functions right now to do all kinds of things that we, like, what I think is we take for granted how the sharing of information is necessary to happen in order for some of the services that we consume regularly and that are highly convenient to us. And if we raise the bar so high, I worry, it's a concern that I have, that many of those services that we currently rely upon will not be convenient anymore. In other words, we'll have to be, those companies will have to be coming back to us for express consent on a lot more things than maybe we would really intend by making this change. So it seems to me that there's a high risk of unintended consequence here of overregulation, but I just wanted to check with you, Mr. Shan, whether you agreed with that and whether you could give us any examples, because I think that's kind of what I'm struggling to think of as an example that would illustrate.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. I think, indeed, I think the desire here again is to make sure that there are appropriate protections in place for information that is truly sensitive. The challenge, of course, is when putting out a list that one that we've allowed for, and that we've assured ourselves that every instance of the utilization of the categories in that list would always meet the test of requiring express consent. And as noted, something like financial data, for instance, can actually be widely construed and may not always necessitate express consent in every single one of those instances. And so I think the challenge, of course, is, as a commercial organization in possession of some of this personal information, if they're actually in receipt of this bill and trying to think about implementation, suddenly there's a whole bunch of potentially new interactions that they're going to need to have potentially to actually implement some of this. And some of it's actually potentially going to get very much in the way of existing business processes. And that's not to say that we don't want to rule out harmful business processes, but some of these are potentially, there may be a better way to try and make sure that sensitive personal information is defined and understood at a broad level, but not to remove those two things that I suggested were important. One was room for guidance, and second was context in some situations, because de facto calling it sensitive in every instance may not actually be accurate to what it does in a particular instance or situation. I'll turn into Mr. Chauber.
I'll just jump in with a short example here. There are circumstances in which pieces of information, for example, purchase data, might not necessarily be considered sensitive in a given context, but in another context, for example, an individual purchasing food items or health products that could relate to a medical diagnosis. In other words, the inferred information that can be captured based on something that seems on the face of it to be, pretty innocuous, could in fact be quite sensitive data. And that's why it's so important to maintain this contextual awareness element in the bill and in the way that it's interpreted and then applied by the OPC.
Just to follow up on that, so if, let's say, some of the information that's included in this list would not necessarily be deemed sensitive in all circumstances, does that mean that it's necessarily unprotected information? Because I don't think that is the case, right? I mean, it's still considered personal information. It's just not in every circumstance would it require express consent to be utilized, collected, utilized, et cetera. But there are still some pretty significant requirements in this bill that would be obligations on the companies that are collecting and using that information, even though it wouldn't necessarily in every circumstance be deemed sensitive. Is that not correct?
That's right. So what CPPA aims to do in broad strokes is ensure that there's a high threshold of privacy protection for all personal information utilized in a commercial context, and that there's significant and meaningful enforcement of obligations related to commercial entities who interact with personal information. What sensitive does is aim to ensure that there's a concentric circle, an inner circle of kind of very protected data for which there's security protocols in place and much higher privacy protections, including about how they got that information in the first place, notably through some form of express consent. So it's not the Wild West or kind of Fort Knox. Ideally, it is highly constrained utilization where it makes sense and how it's utilized, and then very constrained because of the nature of the information at play.
That makes a lot of sense, and I know that we haven't got to those parts of the bill, so it's easy to reflect on definitions at the point we're at and not consider the very high amount of requirements and obligations that companies would be under given all the personal information that they may use. So that's interesting. Now, if we add Mr. Savard Tremblay's sub-amendment to this list, now we're going to any other information. Now, I mean, I think that almost collapses that outer circle to include almost anything as sensitive information. I see that as being a very high risk for unintended consequences. Mr. Shine, could you comment on that?
Certainly, the insertion of the fundamental right to privacy in the bill itself suggests that the fundamental right to privacy applies to personal information. So if we add in a category that is then now sensitive, which is all information for which there is a fundamental right to privacy, which by the preamble is all personal information because of the nature of how we've set out the fundamental right to privacy, then there is no distinction anymore between personal information and sensitive information. All information is sensitive. All information must be treated as such and therefore requires express consent.
So that would have a major implication for the other parts of this bill. In other words, that all personal information already comes with a number of different standards and obligations that essentially it would change the nature of the bill quite considerably, would it not? And what would be the impact if Mr. Savard Tremblay's sub-amendment were to pass?
So if all personal information is sensitive information, essentially there is no other means by which a corporation can ever access information except through the express consent of the individual, which when we think of just the sheer volume of personal information in a commercial context for which is provided, then I'm not sure how one could implement it.
So you're saying it would not be implementable. It would essentially make this bill what? I mean.
Well, I would fundamentally shift business practices because if corporations had to rely on express consent for every single collection of personal information, that's not how the market currently operates. Right. So each bit of personal information derived from I should have all warned you in advance, but my parents are visiting from Winnipeg, so I don't wear. That's my mom and dad. Yes.
Congratulations.
Exactly. It was my way of making sure that you guys were nice today. Exactly. But if my mom's Fitbit. That each piece of data is a piece of personal information related to her activity. If she was required to provide express consent every time that personal information was provided back to the organization, she'd be on her watch all day clicking yes, because every single one of those is an express consent required piece of information because the definition is if information is subject to a fundamental right to privacy, then that's all information, because we've said in the preamble the purpose of personal information is that people have a fundamental right to privacy, which means the privacy related to their personal information. Now, we then mitigate that and enable it through all of the provisions of the rest of the Act that says, here's how that plays out in various situations. Sometimes it's express consent. Here's ways in which you can potentially have a legitimate interest. Here's ways in which you can potentially ensure that there's exceptions to consent. But none of those play out if all information is sensitive, because essentially you then need to expressly say yes every single time.
So, I mean, that sounds to me like it would defeat this bill in a sense, the intentions of it. It would also be very annoying for almost everybody out there that uses services that require the sharing of personal information, including your mom and myself with my Apple Watch. But I'm sure there's many, many, many other examples if you kind of universalize that across our entire economy that we probably take for granted to some degree, but I think would be a major imposition on business functioning to offer the value that we normally experience from those services.
One of the goals of the proposed legislation was to minimize consent fatigue and to maximize consent for that where it is truly important and understood to be important. And so if you have to consent for expressly for every use of the information that you're providing to a corporate entity, then potentially we actually significantly raise the bar for consent fatigue. People get tired of saying yes or no, even if it's in plain language. And so by trying to kind of actually constrain it to that which it's most necessary, which we understand the intent of CPC 7, which is to try and say, let's put some flesh on the bones of what actually is sensitive and where those cases are. We have noted that potentially the categories might be too broad or lack some of that context, and maybe there's a better way of getting at the construct that there is sensitive information. It clearly exists. What kind of contours can we put around it without kind of boxing out the possibility either of saying everything requires consent or saying that consent is always the case for every single type of information, even though there are different uses of types of information, some of which might be sensitive, some of which may not.
Thank you for that. So I don't know whether Mr. Savard Tremblay intended for that to be the case, but I think hearing, the clarifications made here, it seems that this sub-amendment is not going to have an overly helpful effect at achieving the policy objectives of this particular bill. So I'm wondering whether we can maybe vote on that. And I know my colleague, Mr. Gaillard, was on the list to offer some thoughts on the original motion that the Conservatives put forward, which we hope we can get to today. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Turnbull. But in the meantime, we're still on the sub-amendment until I've exhausted the list of speakers. And I have on my list Brad Vist and Mr. Savard Tremblay. And just so you know, we have a motion by Mr. Williams that he'd like to move towards the end of the meeting. So I'd say about 5-1, we could move on to the motion of Mr. Williams. Mr. Vist.
I'll just provide a general comment. I don't believe that this sub-amendment was put forward in ill will, but I would accept some of the rationale about being overly broad in this context, and I think on the CPC side we're going to be voting against it, but that's all.
Je vois qu'il discute avec.
I see there's a discussion with Mr. Williams, but I have Mr. Savard Tremblay's name on the list. Go ahead. You have the floor. Thank you. Well, for about 20 minutes, actually, I wanted us to be able to stop speaking unnecessarily. And so I think I'll withdraw my sub-amendment. I wanted to propose something else. And Mr. Savard Tremblay, I just want to know if I have the unanimous consent from the committee to allow Mr. Savard Tremblay to withdraw his sub-amendment.
Withdraw, Mr. Savard Tremblay.
Parce que j'ai entendu, bien sûr, dans le contexte.
As I did hear the exchanges take place. So I'm just going to throw something out. Perhaps what would be a little more specific and could be a point J would be the end of NDP 6 amendment. That includes personal information in respect of which, due to the context of its use or disclosure, an individual has a high reasonable expectation of privacy. So I think that line actually meets or would be a response to the fears and considerations that had been raised. I see. Okay. So we're talking about point J, and that would become. So is this a sub-amendment that you're moving? Yes, but it actually would be the end of NDP 6. All right, so if you could send that, please, in writing to the clerk so that we can debate it. But considering the amount of time that is left, I may let you wrap up. And if I understand you correctly, you're taking the end of NDP 6 and you're adding that as point J. So you'll be sending that in writing to the clerk. We will send that out to the members and we'll be able to debate that when we come back. I see we have 10 minutes left. And I want us to have time to debate Mr. Williams' motion, and then we'll come back to this.
Proposed by Mr. Savard-Tremblay when we get back to the next meeting, because I'd like for us to have enough time for Mr. Williams' motion. So Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we have circulated a motion. Mr. Chair, you'd think for $15 billion of hard-earned taxpayer dollars, you would think Canada would get supply chains for batteries, some manufacturing job for car parts, even a steering wheel. But in Windsor and Stellantis, I know we've talked about this before, we have $15 billion going to this plant. And we had news from the union, the CBTU members say this week that they're still seeing foreign workers employed over Canadian workers at this plant. At a time when we've made noise on this before that we think these should have been Canadian jobs offered for $15 billion, that Canadians should have been put front and center, and that we worked with the unions to make sure these are good jobs for Windsorites. This is a plant in Windsor. We want the good people of Windsor to have these jobs and to be working in this plant, especially for this amount of money. And we are still hearing from the union that it isn't Canadian workers, that it is foreign workers still working in this union in jobs that were promised to Canadians. Stellantis are even asking their Canadian suppliers to sponsor foreign workers and refugees to perform the work when there are more than 180 Canadian iron workers and millwrights sitting at home unemployed. So this is a big concerning problem we have right now in this government. What we're asking for in this motion, Mr. Chair, that in regard to the government's EV battery plant subsidies, the committee invite the CEOs of Stellantis NV, LG Energy Solutions Limited, Nexstar Energy Incorporated, and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada to answer questions no later than Friday, May 17, 2024. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I have Mr. Massey and Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the motion that's being brought here. I would have sub-amendment to include Minister Vic Fedeli from the province of Ontario. There is a 50-50 partnership that's going on with regards to this investment, and to not have the province would be egregious in many respects, because they are also responsible for allowing and also following up who's on site through the labor code. And so we've had some allegations with regards to the type of work that's being done there, and why we would leave out the province would be, in my opinion, a missed opportunity to understand what's actually taking place and to clear the air. And this is also following another Conservative motion that's being looked at OGO as well, another committee. This one's a little more specific to my riding, and I think the more transparency we would have, the better. And so I would move a sub-amendment that we would include Minister Vic Fedeli and as well any other provincial operatives to enforce the contract. Because, again, this is a 50-50 deal that's being done, and it would be odd to actually exclude the province from doing this. So that's what I would like to do, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. So we've got a sub-amendment to the motion on the floor to include an amendment, an amendment to the motion to include relevant provincial counterparts to the deals pertinent to the motion. So, are there any comments on the amendment proposed by Mr. Massey, Mr. Turnbull?
I don't particularly have an issue with the amendment to the motion. I maybe speak to the motion itself with the amendment, which is that I think
Mr. Turnbull, I'm sorry. I know we just have to deal with the amendment first before we can get back to discussing the motion. So I'm just looking, and I know I have a sense you disagree or might disagree with the motion, but do we agree with the amendment that's proposed? And can we get back to the debate on the motion? Is there? And I'm looking at Mr. Williams because it's your motion.
Yeah, I think the main premise of this motion was support getting the CEOs here. We haven't heard from them, and we haven't had any reaction. The union itself is saying they're not hearing back from the CEO on any level. We've had the minister here, and the minister, I know, when we have discussions on getting the minister here for other items, we can ask the minister those items when the minister's here. This is primarily to get the CEOs here in front of the committee. The province can probably talk about the process, what's happened on their end, in terms of trying to work with these companies. They're going to see this as an investment. I'm sure they're also going to work on behalf of the union, so I don't see it as detrimental to this. But the premise of this was to have the CEOs here. They're the companies that have promised that Canadian workers would get Canadian jobs, and they're not. So I'm indifferent to the amendments, but it's not the focus we wanted this on. It was to focus on the company who needs to answer why they, with the company receiving hard-earned tax dollars, are not putting those hard-earned tax dollars to work for Canadian jobs instead of foreign jobs.
OK, j'ai Monsieur Savard-Tremblay toujours sur l'amendement.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay, on the amendment? Yes, on the amendment. Far be it from me to get involved in what's happening in Ontario. However, that's the heart of the problem here. It seems to me that provinces are accountable before their own populations, not necessarily before the House of Commons, so I would be opposed. I don't see anyone else wishing to speak. So perhaps we could vote on the amendment, and then we'll come back to the motion. So we're going to vote on the amendment. Madam Clerk.
Turnbull.
nay.
Mr. Gahir.
Against?
Madame Lapointe.
No.
Ms. Shanahan.
No.
No.
Mr. Van Bynen.
No.
Mr. Genereux.
No.
Mr. Dreeshen.
No.
Mr. Viss.
No.
Mr. Williams.
No.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
No.
Mr. Massey.
And I find it ironic, it's my riding.
Mais malheureusement, Monsieur Massé, l'amendement est.
Unfortunately, Mr. Massey, the amendment is defeated, and that brings us back to the motion of Mr. Williams.
So I just wanted to say, we had a very detailed subcommittee report that came back to the committee. We had agreed on a set schedule, timeline. We have quite a lot of business. We've prioritized that. We've even wedged in some additional meetings to make sure that I think everybody has opportunities to study their various topics. Obviously, Conservatives, we know that you guys are bring a new motion every single week with a timeline that seems to want to delay C-27 work. So I'm not saying this isn't an important topic. I don't want you to hear it that way. I noticed, though, Mr. Williams, Honda's not even included. You started by talking about Honda. They're not even in the motion that you brought, which is kind of strange. But regardless, I think that our committee calendar is completely full until the end of June when we break for the summer. So I would say that we stick to that. Obviously, if I think the Conservatives we negotiated with consensus or reached consensus around having an additional meeting on SDTC. So if you guys wanted to swap this out for that and have this instead of that, I think that's an option you could consider. But when you bring a new topic every single week that is supposedly urgent, I would just say that you got to prioritize at some point and say, well, what do you really want to study? I think we all have agreed C27 is taking priority. We're digging in. We're doing some great work together. We want to keep that momentum going. So I hope that we can do that. And maybe you guys can either wait till the fall to study this or maybe swap out STTC. That's what I would humbly suggest as an alternative. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really disappointed in this committee and the members moving a motion like this without including the most important partner involved in this investment in Windsor, and for accountability being the province of Ontario, which has not been addressed here federally. I understand the Bloc's position with that, but at the same time, it's actually going against the provincial opportunity to actually have their voice here at the table, as opposed to their voice being used and abused. If you watch the Honda announcement on the weekend, took place or whatever, I mean, it was just unbelievable compliment session for a half an hour, but also included the continuation of the fact that the province of Ontario has been a 50-50 partner with the federal government with regards to all of these investments, including the Windsor one, which had to be done twice because the original investment was not the same as the current ones that were actually offered, and then they actually were going to walk away from the table at that point in time. And so for us not to have the province is actually kind of startling in some degree, because perhaps there's more to be learned from either the federal Conservatives or the federal Liberals with regards to why they don't want the province here to actually describe exactly specifically how they went about creating these decisions that are actually different for each plant. So you have Stellantis that's different, you have Volkswagen that's different, you have Honda that's different. They're all different, but they're all involved with regards to constructing the new facilities and have varying degrees of contracts available to them, not only with regards to the subsidies, whether it be direct cash, whether it be direct subsidies to the battery development later on, or whether it actually be the labor, it all is actually enforced at the end of the day at the province of Ontario, because they actually have the Ministry of Labour and they have the jurisdiction. And why we would actually want to work against a provincial jurisdiction to provide this type of an opportunity to highlight what they're doing is bizarre and twisted, to be quite frank, because how do you have a full partnership in front of us here to describe what's going on, including Stellantis or whoever else, and then you don't even have the second half of the chapter there? It makes no sense whatsoever, and it's not going to lead to a solution. So what we're going to have is continual letters that will come and allegations that take place by a number of different sources. And I appreciate the union coming forward on this, because they're actually on the ground floor right there, but they're also the ones that are dealing with having to actually bring complaints to the province of Ontario. And so it's unbelievable that we would actually consider bringing them forward again without Doug Ford's representation here at the table, given the massive amounts of subsidies that they're putting in. And I can't support basically some type of fishing expedition that's not going to result in actually a real result for workers. And that's what we want, is we want the workers to have the real result. And if you remember correctly, what I had charged in terms of when this first came place last year is that the Stellantis project should have been actually the vessel to create the training and opportunities for the new places that actually are getting the investments now, because it was the forebearer of all those things. And I was there for the actual groundbreaking of the Stellantis project, and at the time, nobody talked about foreign workers. Not the federal government, not the provincial government, nobody. But because of our trade agreements and because of the way that we laid things out, it led us basically susceptible to actually a number of practices that are continuing to agonize the process of really what we need to do as a country is to fight for good auto jobs. And so without that element, a part of it, in terms of having the federal government and the provincial government here, I find it not only just a missed opportunity, I find it disrespectful to the province, I find it disrespectful to the workers, I feel disrespectful to the citizens of Windsor that want clarity of this, and I just think that it's unfortunate, because if we want to continue to use this as a political football, that's fine. If some partisan agreements that have made, I guess, between the province of Ontario and the federal government are too sensitive to talk about here, but it's not going to go away. And if we want something to go away or to be resolved, then we're going to actually have to have the people here that are making the decision and are the true partners. And again, this is the province of Ontario, the federal government, and all the companies involved, and including the unions that actually should have a voice here too as well. Leaving them out is just unacceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Massey. Do I have any other speaker on the list, or can I put the motion to a vote? Je pense que je peux la mettre aux voix. Donc,
I think we can put it to a vote. Madam Clerk?
Against.
Mr. Gahir? Madame Lapointe?
Contre.
Ms. Shanahan?
Against.
Mr. Van Bynen?
No.
Mr. Genereux?
Pour.
Mr. Dreeshen?
Yes.
Mr. Viss?
Yes.
Mr. Williams?
Yes.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay?
Oui.
Mr. Massey?
No.
alors, la motion est défaite.
The motion is defeated. And that brings us right up to the end of the meeting. Thank you to you all, and we will see you Wednesday.